a broken truck on a lonely mountain road. A former Navy SEAL and his loyal dog thought they were only looking for a place to stay for the night. But they had no idea that in the small, snow-covered town ahead, a boy was growing up without a father. An old man was struggling to keep his fragile house standing against the brutal northern winter, while the whole town quietly waited to see who would survive when the blizzard finally arrived. Then one day, in the silence of a small room, the boy looked straight at the soldier and asked a question that made everything stop. "Can you be my dad?" Sometimes a storm can destroy an entire town, but sometimes one small question from a child can change a life forever. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing more meaningful stories. Now, let's begin the story. The road into Gray Hollow did not look dangerous at first. That was the kind of lie northern country liked to tell. In the pale afternoon light, the mountains seemed almost gentle, their shoulders draped in dark pine and washed silver by old snow. The frozen ditches shone like strips of glass. Far beyond the trees, a lake caught the low sun and flashed white-blue, cold and beautiful in the merciless way only winter landscapes could be. It looked like the sort of place that belonged on a calendar pinned in a warm kitchen. It did not look like a place that could leave a man stranded before dark and let the cold finish the conversation. Adrian Cross knew better than to trust pretty weather. At 35, he had the kind of face that seemed carved more by restraint than by ease. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad in the shoulders, lean through the waist, built like a man who had spent years carrying weight because somebody had to. His face was clean-shaven, the hard lines of a square jaw and marked cheekbones left bare by the razor. His skin was fair once, maybe, but northern wind and long time outdoors had roughened it into something darker and drier. His hair was dark brown, clipped short in a military cut grown slightly longer than regulation, as if discipline had loosened but never left. His eyes were gray-blue and steady, the kind that noticed before they judged. They belonged to a man who had seen enough to stop being impressed by noise. He wore the same clothes he wore most days now, an old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, softened by years of wear, faded at the shoulders and frayed lightly at the cuffs. Beneath it, a dark red thermal shirt showed at the collar. His combat pants were worn earth brown with a green cast, the knees dulled and the cargo pockets pulled slightly out of shape from repeated use. His boots were old military work boots, scarred and dependable. On his wrist sat a scratched military watch that had outlived newer, better things. Beside him in the truck cab sat Ranger. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, large and powerfully built, with a sable coat that shifted through cream, gray, and black depending on the light. Darker fur ran along his back and ears. Pale cream brightened his chest and legs. His amber eyes carried an unnerving intelligence, as if he were always listening to a conversation other creatures could not hear. Around his body was a black harness edged with a muted deep red, just enough color to catch the eye before disappearing back into shadow. Ranger was not restless, not fussy, not eager to please. He watched. He decided. Then he moved. Adrian's truck hit the hidden rut so hard the whole frame lurched. The sound came a beat later, metal striking stone, then a brutal cracking jolt from beneath the chassis. He swore once, low and flat. The steering wheel kicked in his hands. The truck limped forward another few yards, shuddered, then died with the kind of final cough that told him this was not going to be fixed with hope and cursing. Ranger lifted his head immediately. Adrian coasted the truck to the edge of the narrow road and cut the ignition out of habit, though there was nothing left to kill. For a moment he sat still, one hand on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the pine-lined road stretching empty ahead. No traffic, no houses, no signal bars. Of course. He exhaled through his nose, pushed open the door, and stepped into the cold. The air hit with clean teeth. It smelled of sap, ice, and the faint mineral scent of old snow buried under new crust. He crouched beside the truck, checked underneath, and saw enough in 30 seconds to know the day had just changed shape. The damage wasn't cosmetic. Something in the driveline had given way hard. Maybe the truck could be towed. It would not be driven anywhere tonight. He straightened slowly, rubbing one gloved thumb along his jaw. He had been on his way to see an old teammate 2 towns over, a man who had called twice in the past month and, in the careful language men like them used, admitted life had grown heavier than he preferred to carry alone. Adrian had told himself the drive was practical. Just a visit, just a favor. Not because he was tired of roads that ended in cheap motels and mornings with no reason to stay put. Not because, somewhere beneath all that soldier's economy, he was beginning to wonder how long a man could keep moving before motion itself turned into another form of hiding. Ranger hopped down from the cab and stood beside him, ears up. "Yeah," Adrian murmured. "I know." He checked his phone, anyway. No signal. He slid it back into his pocket and looked up and down the road. The sky had that thin winter clarity that could betray a man. The sun was still up, but it was already losing authority. In these mountains, light left early and cold arrived offended. Then Ranger froze, not stiff with fear, not alert with excitement, just still. His head turned toward the slope above the road, ears angled sharply, body slightly forward. Adrian followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw only trees' pine trunks rising dark and straight, patches of old snow clinging to roots and rock, the slanted gold of late-day light slipping between branches. Then movement. A figure coming down a narrow trail cut into the hillside. An old man. He carried a bundle of split wood tied in rope across his back. Even from a distance, there was something deliberate about him, a kind of hard-earned efficiency that age had not taken. He moved carefully rather than weakly, planting each step where it would hold. When he reached the road, he stopped a few yards away and looked at Adrian without speaking. Elias Thorne was somewhere in his 70s, though winter country aged people in ways numbers failed to measure. He was tall for an old man, but drawn thin by labor and years. His face was narrow and weathered, the skin lined deeply around the mouth and eyes. White hair, combed back with stubborn neatness, showed beneath a dark wool cap. His coat was thick brown canvas patched at one elbow, worn over a faded plaid shirt. Heavy gloves covered his hands. His eyes were pale blue, tired but sharp. Not suspicious, exactly. Measured. Like a man who had learned that welcome and regret sometimes arrived, dressed the same. His gaze moved over Adrian's posture, the boots, the old watch, the quiet way he stood beside bad luck without performing outrage. Then his eyes lingered on Adrian's face. Something shifted there. Not softness, not recognition, something closer to impact. For a brief second, Adrian had the unsettling feeling that the old man was not looking at him alone, but through him, at someone laid over his features by memory. Adrian broke the silence first. Truck's done for now. Is there a garage nearby? Elias glanced at the sky before answering. Garage in town closes early this time of year. His voice was dry, roughened by cold and disuse. At this hour it'll be shut. Adrian nodded once. Any motel? The old man gave the road a slow look, as if checking whether the mountains had somehow sprouted one in the last hour. No motel around here. That landed where Adrian had expected it to. The wind shifted lightly through the pines, carrying a colder thread from higher up. Ranger stepped closer to the old man, then sat down, not submissive, not guarded, simply present. Elias looked at the dog. The lines around his eyes tightened in some private thought. Adrian was not a man who enjoyed asking for anything. It sat badly on him, like borrowed clothes. But daylight was thinning, and pride was a poor insulator. If it's not too much trouble, he said, choosing the plainest version of the truth, I'd be grateful for a roof for one night. Elias did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted past Adrian toward the truck, then to Ranger again, then back to Adrian's face. There was hesitation there now, real and visible. Not because the request was unreasonable, but because there was something waiting at the end of the answer. When he spoke, it was slower. I've got my grandson at the house. So that was the line. Not fear for himself. Fear of what a stranger might bring to a child. Adrian inclined his head. I understand. And he did. More than Elias knew. Men who had lived through danger often learned the same lesson. Once your own safety stopped mattering much, the safety of the small and trusting became sacred. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint creak of rope against firewood and the distant hiss of wind in the treetops. Then Ranger did something odd. He rose, stepped toward Elias, and gently touched his nose to the old man's gloved hand. It was a small gesture. Almost nothing. But Adrian knew this dog. Ranger did not offer trust cheaply. He had growled at polished officers and loved scarred mechanics. He had disliked charming men for good reason and followed broken ones into storms. When he made up his mind about a person, Adrian had learned to pay attention. Elias stared at the dog's muzzle, resting briefly against his knuckles. Something in his face eased not open, not warm, but loosened, as if a knot tied years ago had given half an inch. Then, unexpectedly, the old man said, almost to himself, "You look like my son did from a distance." The words hung there between the trees. Adrian did not move. Elias seemed to realize he had spoken aloud and turned his face slightly away, ashamed not of grief, but of having let it show. In that moment the road felt stranger, deeper, as if Adrian had not broken down here by accident at all, but been delivered into the exact path of a memory that had been walking the mountains for years with a load of wood on its back. When Elias looked at him again, the decision had already been made. "House is up the hill," he said. "Small place. Warm enough." He shifted the weight of the firewood and added, with a stiffness that made the kindness harder and therefore more honest, "You can stay the night." Relief was too soft a word for what moved through Adrian. It was not comfort, more like a loosening in the chest he would not have admitted to under questioning. "Thank you," he said. Elias gave one curt nod, as if gratitude embarrassed him almost as much as memory. "Bring what you need." Adrian gathered a duffel from the truck, locked it out of habit, and cast one last glance over the stranded vehicle. It looked oddly temporary now, as if it had already become part of the road instead of part of him. The climb to the house was steeper than it first appeared. The trail wound through pines and birch, across exposed roots and stone glazed with old ice. Elias moved ahead with the sure-footed patience of a man who had taken this path in all seasons. Adrian followed behind with his bag over one shoulder. Ranger ranged silently between them, sometimes taking the lead, sometimes falling back to check on Adrian, his harness catching brief dark red glints in the sinking light. They crested the rise just as the sun lowered behind the western ridge. The house came into view all at once. It sat on the shoulder of the hill overlooking the valley below, a modest wooden house with a steep roof and smoke curling from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon. Time and weather had worked it over. The boards were darkened in places, the porch rail slightly uneven, the structure carrying that unmistakable look of a home kept standing by effort rather than luck. But in the winter light, with the chimney breathing and the windows holding the last amber of day, it had the stubborn dignity of something that had refused to die simply because conditions suggested it should. Adrian slowed without meaning to. There was something about houses like that. They did not ask for admiration. They earned it. Below, tucked in the valley, he could see the edges of Gray Hollow. A scattering of buildings, thin roads, the faint geometry of lives arranged against the cold. From up here, the town looked peaceful, almost delicate. Too far away to help fast if weather turned. Elias mounted the porch first and set down the wood with a muted grunt. For a moment he stood with one hand on the door, not opening it yet. His profile in the fading light looked carved from the same old wood as the house. Then he glanced back at Adrian. "Boy's name is Noah," he said. "He's quiet. Don't mistake that for not seeing things." Adrian almost smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." At that, something in Elias's expression came close to humor, though it passed like a shy animal through brush. He opened the door. Warm air touched Adrian's facewood smoke, old pine, and something simmering faintly from a pot inside. Real warmth. Human warmth. The kind that reached places cold had no business visiting. Ranger crossed the threshold without hesitation. Adrian followed him in. And behind them, evening finally closed over the hill. Warmth was the first thing Adrian noticed. Not the loud, aggressive heat of a furnace, but the slow, honest warmth of a wood stove that had been fed all afternoon by patient hands. The small house smelled of pine boards, dry smoke, and something simmering gently in an iron pot, beans, maybe, or stew thickened by time rather than recipe. After the long, cold climb up the hill, the air felt almost alive. Adrian paused just inside the doorway. Years of habit made him scan a room automatically. Exits, windows, angles, shadows. The main room was modest and square, the kind of place built by people who measured necessity more carefully than pride. A narrow kitchen corner stood to the left, with a wooden table worn pale in the center where generations of elbows had rested. To the right sat the iron stove, blackened from long use but clean, a kettle murmuring quietly on top. Ranger stepped inside ahead of him and immediately slowed his pace. The dog's nose lifted slightly, reading the unfamiliar scents: wood smoke, old books, cold wool, and something younger beneath it all. Movement came from the far side of the room. A boy stood there, half hidden behind the edge of a doorframe. He could not have been more than 9. His build was narrow, the wiry kind children sometimes developed when they grew up in places where winters demanded resilience early. His hair was soft brown and slightly messy, as if a comb had been attempted and then abandoned halfway through. His skin was pale with the faint freckles of a child who spent summers outdoors. But his eyes were the part that held attention clear gray-green, curious and cautious at the same time. He looked first at Ranger, then at Adrian, then back at Ranger again. Elias stepped past Adrian and set the firewood beside the stove with a dull thud. "Noah," he said, his voice gentler than it had been outside. "This is Mr. Cross." His truck gave out on the road. Noah didn't speak right away. Children in small towns learned early that strangers were puzzles worth studying before solving. Ranger tilted his head. For a moment, the dog and the boy simply looked at each other. The German shepherd's thick sable coat caught the firelight, shifting between gray, cream, and black. His amber eyes held steady, calm, and curious, with none of the restless excitement some dogs showed around new people. Finally, Noah stepped forward, slowly. He stopped 2 feet from Ranger. "You're big," the boy said quietly. Ranger's tail moved once. Adrian crouched beside the dog, resting a hand briefly on the harness strap. "His name's Ranger." Noah repeated the name under his breath, testing it. "Ranger." Then he looked up at Adrian with a seriousness that felt older than his age. "Is he a police dog?" Adrian shook his head. "Not exactly." That answer seemed acceptable. Noah reached out carefully and placed his small hand on the dog's head. Ranger didn't move. If anything, he leaned slightly into the touch. Elias watched the interaction from the stove. Something in his shoulders relaxed, almost invisibly. "Sit," he said to Adrian, gesturing toward the table. Adrian set his bag down near the wall and removed his gloves. The heat in the room seeped slowly back into his fingers, prickling like returning circulation after long cold. He sat. Across from him, Noah climbed onto a chair. The boy studied him openly now. Adrian had seen that look before, from young recruits, from children on bases overseas, from strangers who were trying to place a face inside a story they already believed. "You're a soldier," Noah said finally. It wasn't a question. Adrian glanced briefly at Elias before answering. "Used to be." Noah leaned forward, elbows on the table. "My dad was in the Navy." Elias stirred the pot on the stove without turning around. The room held that quiet pause that happens when someone has stepped onto ground where memory lives. Adrian nodded once. "That's a good branch." Noah's eyes brightened slightly. "He was really brave," the boy said quickly. "Grandpa says he saved people." Elias cleared his throat softly at the stove, but didn't contradict the boy. Adrian noticed a wall to his right then. Drawings covered it, not framed, just sheets of paper taped or pinned in careful rows. Crayon mountains, pine trees, a lake, and in several drawings, a tall figure in dark uniform standing beside a large dog. Adrian stood and walked closer. One drawing caught his eye. The man in it was drawn larger than the others. His shoulders were wide, his stance strong. A small flag waved behind him. Beside him stood a dog clearly meant to be Ranger, though the boy had never seen him before today. Adrian studied the drawing a moment longer. "That him?" he asked quietly. Noah nodded. "That's my dad." The boy hesitated, then added with shy pride, "He's like the Navy SEALs." Adrian didn't correct him. Children sometimes built ladders out of imagination to reach the memory of someone they missed. And sometimes those ladders were the only way they could climb high enough to see them again. Elias set 3 bowls on the table. Eat before it cools. Dinner was simple bean stew thick with potatoes and pieces of smoked meat, but it tasted like something earned. Outside, the last of the evening light drained slowly from the windows. The forest beyond the hill darkened into layered silhouettes of pine. They ate mostly in silence. Noah asked small questions between bites. "Does Ranger sleep outside?" "No." "Can he smell bears?" "Probably." The boy seemed satisfied with that. At one point, Ranger left Adrian's side and wandered toward the wall of drawings. He sniffed near the paper edges. Then he sat, right beneath the picture of the tall soldier. Noah noticed immediately. "That's funny," he murmured. Adrian looked up. Ranger rarely chose a place randomly. The dog lifted his gaze and stared at the drawing as if it contained a scent too old for human noses. Then something unexpected happened. Ranger stood slowly and stepped closer to the wall. He raised his nose and lightly touched the corner of the drawing with it. The paper shifted against the wood. Noah froze. Adrian felt the moment settle in the room like snow falling silently on a field. The boy whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. "He likes that one." Elias turned from the stove. For a second, his expression changed. Not grief exactly, not surprise. Something quieter, something closer to recognition. Adrian didn't say anything, but he felt the same strange sensation he had experienced on the road earlier. The sense that the day had folded together 2 paths that had been walking toward each other for a long time. Ranger stepped back, satisfied, and returned to lie beside Adrian's chair. The spell broke as easily as it had formed. Noah resumed eating, but he kept glancing at the dog, and at Adrian. Later that evening, the boy brought out a small notebook from the shelf beside the stove. "Do you want to see something?" Adrian nodded. Noah opened the notebook to a fresh page. Inside were dozens of drawings: soldiers, trucks, dogs, mountains, boats on dark water. Each one carried the same tall figure somewhere in the scene. Sometimes the soldier stood on a hill. Sometimes he helped someone up. Sometimes he simply watched over the town. Adrian noticed that in every drawing the soldier's face was simple, just 2 dots for eyes and a line for a mouth. Children rarely drew what they couldn't remember clearly, but they always drew what they wished to keep. Noah flipped through several pages before stopping. "This one's new." The drawing showed the house on the hill. 3 figures stood outside it. One was clearly Elias. One was Noah. And the third, Noah scratched the back of his head, embarrassed. "I didn't know what you looked like yet," he admitted. Adrian studied the page. The third figure was tall, standing beside the dog. The boy had drawn the soldier slightly larger than the others, the way children often drew heroes, not because they were physically bigger, but because their presence filled more space. Adrian felt a small pressure behind his ribs. He had spent years trying not to become anyone's symbol of strength again. War had taught him that people placed too much weight on that idea. But looking at the drawing, he understood something else too. Sometimes children didn't need perfection. They only needed someone who stood still when the wind rose. Elias poured coffee into chipped mugs and sat down heavily. The old man's pale blue eyes watched Adrian carefully. "You planning to get that truck out tomorrow?" he asked. "If the garage has a tow," Adrian said. Ben Carter's name had been mentioned earlier in passing as the town's mechanic. Elias nodded slowly. "Road's rough in the morning if the frost holds." Noah leaned forward. "You're leaving tomorrow?" Adrian glanced at the boy. "That's the plan." The boy nodded as if that made sense, but he looked down at his drawing again. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching both of them with quiet attention. Outside, the wind brushed through the pine trees again, whispering against the roof like distant surf. Inside the house, the stove popped softly as a log shifted. Adrian leaned back in the chair, feeling warmth soak through the old combat shirt into his shoulders. For the first time since the truck had broken down, he allowed himself to relax fully. Just for tonight. The mountains outside did not care where a man belonged, but the small house on the hill, with its drawings on the wall and a boy who believed in heroes, seemed to be asking the question anyway. And Adrian Cross, former SEAL, traveler between towns, man who had spent years avoiding places that might hold him, found himself wondering why the question felt harder to ignore here than anywhere else. Morning arrived quietly on the hill. The first light slid through the narrow kitchen window in a pale band, catching the steam from the kettle and turning it into a thin ghost drifting above the stove. The house creaked softly as the night cold loosened its grip on the wood. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the pine branches with the patient sigh of something ancient and indifferent. Adrian Cross was already awake. Years of military routine had trained his body to rise before daylight, whether he wished to or not. He sat at the small wooden table with a mug of black coffee warming his hands, his posture straight, even in rest. The olive tactical shirt he wore had softened with age, but still carried the faint geometry of discipline across the shoulders. His gray-blue eyes watched the world through the window as if studying terrain rather than scenery. Outside, the valley of Gray Hollow lay under a thin frost. From up here, the town looked small enough to fit inside a man's memory. A scattering of rooftops, narrow roads weaving between them, smoke curling from chimneys like quiet signals of life. It was peaceful in the deceptive way winter mornings could be. Peace often hid weak structures. Adrian took another sip of coffee and listened. Not to the birds, not to the wind, to the house. Every structure spoke if someone knew how to hear it. Wood shifted, nails strained, beams whispered their complaints to the air. This house had a lot to say. Behind him, Ranger stirred. The German shepherd lifted his head from where he had been lying near the stove. His sable coat glowed softly in the morning light, the dark fur along his spine fading into pale cream around his chest and legs. His amber eyes blinked once, calm and alert, before he stood and stretched. Adrian watched him. "You hear it too," he murmured. Ranger padded toward the back wall of the room, sniffing lightly along the boards. His ears tilted forward as he studied something invisible to human senses. The dog stopped near the north side of the house. That alone told Adrian enough. Cold wind always preferred that direction in these mountains. Footsteps sounded from the hallway. Elias Thorne entered the room carrying an armload of split wood. In daylight, the old man looked even more weathered than he had the night before. His white hair was combed back neatly, but the deep lines in his narrow face held shadows that sleep could not smooth away. His blue eyes had the faraway patience of someone who had spent many winters watching storms move across the same mountains. "You're up early," Elias said. Adrian shrugged slightly. "Habit." Elias placed the wood beside the stove and crouched with a grunt to feed the fire. Noah appeared a moment later. The boy moved quietly, his socks whispering against the wooden floor. His hair was still rumpled from sleep, and he carried the small notebook he had shown Adrian the night before, as if it were something fragile. "Morning," he said. Adrian nodded to him. Noah sat at the table and began sketching immediately, the pencil moving across the page in quick, certain strokes. Elias poured oatmeal into bowls and placed them on the table. Breakfast passed mostly in silence. Adrian's mind kept returning to the walls, and the roof, and the way the wind had leaned against the house during the night. Finally, he stood. "I want to take a look outside." Elias glanced up, but didn't question him. Adrian stepped onto the porch. The cold air struck his face clean and sharp. The hill behind the house sloped steeply upward into dense pine forest, while the ground in front fell gradually toward the valley. It was a beautiful place to build a home, but beauty had never stopped physics. He walked around the side of the house slowly, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt. The first problem appeared within seconds. The north wall. The boards were thinner there than they should have been, and the seams between them had widened over time. Cold air slipped through the gaps like invisible water. Adrian ran his gloved hand along the wood. Too much exposure. Too little insulation. Ranger followed him outside and sniffed the same section of wall. Then the dog moved further along the foundation. Adrian crouched. The ground beneath the house was uneven. Frost heave had lifted one corner slightly over the years, creating a subtle tilt that most people would never notice. But snow would notice. Wind would notice. Winter always noticed. Adrian stood again and looked at the roofline. The angle was wrong for heavy snow. It would hold weight instead of shedding it. He exhaled slowly. This house was not fragile, but it was tired. Behind him, the door opened. Elias stepped out onto the porch, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. "You inspecting my place?" the old man asked. Adrian didn't answer immediately. He studied the roof once more before speaking. "When was the last time you replaced these boards?" Elias followed his gaze. 15 years, maybe." Adrian nodded. "That explains it." Elias waited. "What?" Adrian turned toward him. "This house won't handle a hard winter." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Elias frowned slightly. "It's handled plenty." Adrian pointed toward the north wall. "Wind hits there first. Snow drifts against it. Once the seams open wider, the heat bleeds out faster than the stove can replace it." Elias looked unconvinced, but not offended. Adrian continued. "And the roof angle will trap snow instead of sliding it off." The old man studied the structure again, slower this time. Noah stepped onto the porch behind them, hugging his notebook against his chest. "Is the house in trouble?" the boy asked. Adrian knelt to Noah's level. "Not yet." Noah relaxed slightly. Adrian stood and looked back at Elias. "You ever had a winter where the snow piled high enough to block the windows?" Elias's eyes darkened. "Once," he said quietly. "Years ago." Adrian nodded. He could imagine it easily. And once snow reached the wrong height, the pressure against the walls changed everything. The wind rose slightly through the trees. Ranger turned his head sharply toward the forest. Then the dog did something unusual. Instead of barking or running toward the sound, Ranger walked slowly to the north corner of the house and sat down. Perfectly still. His amber eyes fixed on the wall. Adrian felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ranger did not sit like that without reason. The dog's ears twitched once. Adrian stepped closer to the wall. A faint whistle slipped through one of the seams, barely audible, but steady. Cold air, moving constantly through the boards. Adrian pressed his palm against the wood. The cold on the other side felt deeper than it should have been for early winter. He stepped back. The calculation finished forming in his mind. Elias waited. Adrian turned toward him. "You can patch this house," he said slowly. "Or you can change how it fights winter." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Adrian looked around the property again. "I'd move the stove to the center of the house." Elias blinked. "That stove's been there 30 years. Adrian continued. "Then I'd thicken the north wall and add a wind buffer at the door." Noah looked confused. "A wind buffer?" "A small entry space," Adrian explained gently, "so cold air doesn't rush straight into the house." Elias crossed his arms. "You're talking about rebuilding half the place." Adrian shrugged. "Not rebuilding." He looked back at the roofline. "Changing how it works." Silence stretched across the porch. The wind moved through the pines again. Noah stared at the house with new worry. Elias finally spoke. "My son built part of this house." The words carried more weight than the cold. Adrian nodded. "I figured." Elias studied him carefully. "You saying it's not good enough?" Adrian shook his head. "No." He met the old man's eyes. "I'm saying winter doesn't care who built it." Noah looked between them. The boy's small fingers tightened around his notebook. Elias breathed out slowly. The decision sat somewhere deep in his chest, wrestling with memory. Finally, he said, "What would you change first?" Adrian glanced once more at the north wall, then the roof, then the door. He answered quietly, "The way the house faces the storm." Elias nodded slowly. Noah looked relieved. And Ranger finally stood up, walking back to Adrian's side, as if satisfied that the humans had heard what the wind had been trying to say. The road into Gray Hollow was little more than a ribbon of packed dirt and old gravel, winding through pine forest that seemed older than the town itself. In early winter light, the valley carried a quiet, beauty-thin smoke from chimneys, frost clinging to wooden fences, and the distant echo of an engine somewhere deeper in town. Adrian drove slowly. Elias's truck rattled slightly over the uneven road, its old suspension complaining at every bump. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but relaxed, his sable coat catching small flashes of sunlight as the trees thinned. They had left the house shortly after sunrise. Adrian needed to reach Ben Carter's garage to arrange a tow for his broken truck. But the drive had another purpose now, one Elias hadn't asked for, but had quietly accepted. Adrian needed supplies. If the house on the hill was going to survive a hard winter, it would need more than conversation. It would need work. Gray Hollow revealed itself slowly as the road curved downhill. The town was small, no more than a few dozen buildings gathered around a single main street. A grocery store with peeling paint, a diner whose windows glowed warm with morning light, a church with a narrow steeple that leaned slightly to one side as if listening to the valley. People noticed the truck immediately. Small towns always did. A tall man stepped out of the diner doorway, wiping his hands on a faded apron. His name was Samuel Ortega, though most people in town simply called him Sam. He was in his early 50s, thick through the shoulders with the sturdy build of someone who had spent decades lifting crates and leaning over hot grills. His hair was black, threaded with silver at the temples, and his deep-set brown eyes carried the quiet humor of a man who preferred watching people before speaking. Sam leaned against the doorframe and watched the truck roll past. His gaze shifted from Adrian to Ranger, then to Elias. He gave a slow nod that carried equal parts greeting and curiosity. Inside the diner, conversation paused. Adrian noticed the stares but didn't react. Years in uniform had taught him the difference between attention and hostility. These people were simply measuring him. Ben Carter's garage stood at the far end of town. It was a long, rectangular building with faded red siding and a sign that had once been bright, but now hung crooked above the door. The smell of oil and metal drifted through the open bay, mixing with the cold air. Ben Carter himself emerged from beneath the hood of an old pickup as Adrian stepped inside. Ben was a broad man in his mid-40s, with thick forearms and permanently grease-stained hands. His beard was dark and uneven, trimmed more for practicality than appearance, and his brown hair stuck out beneath a wool cap that had probably survived 20 winters. But his eyes, sharp, practical, and constantly moving, belonged to a mechanic who trusted machines more than people. "Morning," Ben said, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze moved quickly from Adrian to Ranger. "That your dog?" Adrian nodded once. "German Shepherd." Ben grunted with approval. "Good breed." Elias explained the situation while Adrian stepped outside to examine the hardware supplies stacked beside the garage. Lumber, nails, scrap metal sheets. Adrian's mind worked through measurements automatically. Wind pressure, snow load, insulation gaps. He already knew what needed to change. Ben joined him outside a moment later. "Elias says you think his place won't hold through winter." Adrian glanced at him. "Depends on the storm." Ben crossed his arms. "You some kind of contractor?" Adrian shook his head. "Combat engineer." Ben raised his eyebrows slightly. "Well," he muttered, "that explains the way you look at buildings." Adrian allowed the faintest smile. Ben leaned against the doorframe and studied him more closely. "You're planning to rebuild his house?" "No." Adrian pointed toward the valley wind line visible between the mountains. "I'm planning to make it harder for winter to break it." Ben chuckled softly. "Town's gonna love that." Adrian followed his gaze down the road. People were already talking. A thin man stood near the grocery store, whispering to someone beside him. Two women near the diner glanced toward the garage and quickly looked away when Adrian noticed. Small towns didn't just share weather reports, they shared opinions. Ben wiped his hands again. "You know, Elias built that house with his son." Adrian nodded. "I figured." Ben studied him another moment. "You planning to tear into it anyway?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Ranger walked past them, nose lifted to the air, reading scents carried by the cold wind. Finally, Adrian spoke. "I'm planning to help it survive." Ben shrugged. "Well, that'll make you popular." Adrian doubted that. By midday, the truck bed carried a stack of lumber and several bundles of supplies. The drive back up the hill was slower. Noah ran out of the house as soon as he heard the engine. The boy skidded to a stop in the frosty dirt, eyes wide at the pile of wood and metal in the back of the truck. "Are you fixing the house?" he asked breathlessly. Adrian climbed down from the driver's seat. "Something like that?" Noah grinned. Elias watched quietly from the porch. Work began that afternoon. Adrian started with the north wall. The old boards came off one at a time, revealing the hollow interior where wind had been slipping through unnoticed for years. Ranger stayed nearby, occasionally pacing along the edge of the clearing as if guarding the worksite. Noah followed Adrian everywhere. Why are you putting the board sideways? Wind pushes less against that direction. Why the metal sheet? To break the air before it hits the wood. The boy nodded seriously, committing every answer to memory. Elias stood with his hands in his coat pockets, observing with a mixture of skepticism and growing curiosity. The structure began to change slowly. Not prettier, stranger. Thicker walls, reinforced beams, an extra angled roof support that looked almost unnecessary to anyone who hadn't studied snow loads. By late afternoon, the house already looked different. Rehook Ranger suddenly stopped pacing. The dog turned toward the road leading up the hill and stared into the trees. His ears lifted sharply. Adrian followed the direction of the dog's gaze. Moments later, a pickup truck appeared between the pines. 3 men climbed out. The first was a tall, lean man with a sharp jaw and narrow eyes that held the restless impatience of someone who didn't like change. His name was Martin Pike, a logger who had lived in Gray Hollow his entire life. His beard was thin and reddish, and his weathered face carried the hard edges of years spent arguing with stubborn equipment and harsher winters. Behind him stood 2 other town residents who looked less confident, but just as curious. Martin crossed his arms as he examined the house. "What in the world are you doing to this place?" he asked. Adrian set down his hammer. "Strengthening it." Martin snorted. "Looks more like you're ruining it." Noah shifted uncomfortably beside Adrian. Elias stepped forward slowly. "It's my house," the old man said quietly. Martin looked from Elias to Adrian again. "You letting some drifter rebuild it?" The word hung in the air. Adrian didn't react. Years of service had taught him something valuable. Arguments rarely strengthened structures. Work did. Martin walked closer, studying the reinforced wall. "That won't stop a real storm," he muttered. Adrian wiped his hands on a cloth. "No." Martin looked pleased for half a second. Then Adrian continued, "But it'll slow it down." Silence settled across the yard. The wind moved through the trees again, whispering over the half-finished wall. Martin shook his head. "You're wasting your time." He turned back toward his truck. "Town's already saying that house looks like a bunker." Noah looked worried, but Elias didn't respond. He simply watched Adrian pick up the hammer again. The steady rhythm of construction resumed. Board by board, beam by beam. By evening, the north wall stood stronger than it had in decades. The house looked unusual now, angular in places where it had once been simple. But Adrian could already feel the difference in the air flow around the structure. Ranger lay near the porch steps, head resting on his paws, watching the work with quiet satisfaction. The sun dropped slowly behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the clearing. Noah sat on the porch beside Elias, drawing in his notebook again. This time the house in his sketch looked different, stronger, stranger. And beside it stood the same tall soldier figure he always drew. But tonight the boy added something new. The soldier was holding a hammer. The morning sky above Gray Hollow carried the pale color of steel. It was the kind of sky that looked quiet at first glance, but felt wrong to anyone who had lived long enough around mountains. The clouds were thin but moving fast, sliding across the peaks like restless thoughts that could not settle. Adrian noticed immediately. He stepped out onto the porch before sunrise, the cold air biting gently at his face. The reinforced wall they had finished the previous evening stood behind him, solid, silent, already doing its job. The north wind brushed against it and slid sideways instead of slipping through the boards. A small improvement. But winter did not measure in small improvements. Ranger emerged behind him. The German shepherd stretched slowly, his sable coat thick against the morning cold. His amber eyes scanned the tree line with the alert patience of a creature who had learned that danger rarely announced itself loudly. Adrian leaned against the porch railing. He watched the sky, watched the wind, watched the valley. Something about the air felt tense. Behind him, the door creaked open. Elias stepped outside carrying a metal mug filled with coffee. His thin frame looked even smaller wrapped in his heavy brown coat, but the old man moved with the careful steadiness of someone who had survived enough winters to know which signs mattered. "You see it too," Elias said quietly. Adrian nodded. "Pressure drop." Elias looked toward the mountains. "My bones say snow." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. "Your bones are probably right." Noah appeared on the porch a few moments later, his notebook tucked under one arm. The boy's dark hair was still messy from sleep, but his eyes were already bright with curiosity. "Is the storm coming?" he asked. Adrian knelt slightly so they were eye level. "Maybe." Noah frowned. "That doesn't sound good?" "It depends," Adrian replied gently. "Storms aren't the problem." "What is?" "Being unprepared." Noah nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson with the serious attention he gave everything Adrian said. The work resumed after breakfast. Adrian began reinforcing the roof supports. The old beams inside the attic had held for years, but they were too narrow to carry the kind of snow weight that sometimes fell in the northern mountains. Adrian measured carefully, cutting new angled braces that redistributed the load toward the thicker walls. Ranger followed him up the ladder into the attic. Dust floated through the air in pale clouds as the dog moved cautiously across the wooden planks. His ears twitched constantly, listening to the wind moving through the roof like distant breath. Below them, Elias and Noah sorted tools. The boy tried to help with everything carrying nails, handing up boards, asking questions faster than the adults could answer them. "Why are the beams angled like that?" "Snow slides down faster if the weight shifts sideways." "Why do you measure twice?" "Because wood doesn't forgive mistakes." Noah wrote several of those answers into his notebook. By midday, the sky had darkened slightly. The wind moved faster now, brushing through the pine forest with a restless sound that reminded Adrian of waves breaking on distant shorelines. He had heard that sound before, often before storms. While Adrian worked, Elias drove into town to collect a few additional supplies Ben Carter had promised to lend them. The truck returned an hour later, but Elias was not alone. A small blue sedan followed him up the hill. Adrian climbed down from the ladder as the car door opened. A woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 30s, tall and slender, with the composed posture of someone accustomed to responsibility. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a practical knot at the base of her neck, and her skin carried the pale tone of someone who spent most of her days indoors rather than working outside. Her eyes were gray-green sharp, observant, and tired in the way that came from caring too much about other people's problems. Elias gestured toward her. "This is Sarah Whitaker." Sarah offered Adrian a small, polite smile. "She's the town's school teacher," Elias explained. Sarah extended her hand. "I've heard about you." Adrian shook it. "That's rarely good news." Sarah laughed softly. "Depends who you ask." She glanced toward the reinforced walls of the house. "I came to see the bunker everyone's talking about." Adrian followed her gaze. "It's not a bunker." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "No? It's preparation." Sarah studied him for a moment longer. Something in Adrian's calm certainty seemed to interest her. Before she could ask another question, Noah ran down the porch steps toward the car. "Miss Whitaker!" Sarah smiled warmly at him. "Noah." The boy looked proud and slightly embarrassed at the same time. "Are you bringing the math books?" Sarah reached into the back seat and handed him a small stack of worn school books. "Your grandfather said you were behind." Noah groaned quietly. Adrian watched the interaction carefully. Sarah Whitaker had the patient voice of someone used to guiding children through frustration rather than forcing them through it. The town probably depended on her more than it realized. Elias began unloading the truck. New lumber, more nails, a coil of heavy rope, supplies that would matter soon. Ranger suddenly froze. The dog had been lying near the porch, half asleep, but now he stood upright with his ears rigid and his body angled toward the valley. Not toward the forest, toward town. His amber eyes narrowed slightly. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger took several steps down the hill. He sniffed the air again. Then he released a low, uncertain sound. Not a growl, not a bark. Something between curiosity and warning. Adrian followed the dog's gaze. Far below them, near the road that led through Gray Hollow, a thin column of dark smoke rose into the sky. Not chimney smoke. Too thick. Too sudden. Sarah noticed it next. "That's not normal." Elias shaded his eyes with one hand. "Ben's garage is that direction." Noah looked worried. "Is it on fire?" The smoke continued climbing slowly into the pale sky. Adrian studied the distance, too far away to see clearly, but close enough to matter. After several long seconds, the smoke thinned and faded. Whatever had caused it had stopped. Elias lowered his hand. Probably nothing. But Ranger did not relax immediately. The dog watched the valley for another full minute before finally returning to the porch. Adrian filed the moment away quietly. Sometimes storms arrived in more than one form. Work resumed. Sarah stayed longer than she had intended. She watched Adrian adjust the roof braces with quiet fascination. "You've done this before," she said eventually. Adrian nodded. "Just not on houses." She looked puzzled. "Then where?" Adrian tightened the final bolt before answering. "Forward bases." Sarah didn't ask more, but her expression changed slightly. The wind grew colder by late afternoon. Snow began to fall just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. At first it was gentle, thin flakes drifting through the pine trees like feathers. But Adrian noticed the speed of the wind increasing again, and the way the snow moved sideways rather than down. The storm was coming. The house, however, felt different now, stronger, prepared. Adrian stood on the porch beside Ranger as darkness settled over Gray Hollow. The dog leaned slightly against his leg. Both of them watched the valley quietly. Winter was approaching. But this time, the house would be ready. The storm did not arrive all at once. It began the way many northern storms did, with quiet patience. Snow fell through the darkness in thin, drifting layers, soft enough that a person might almost ignore it. The wind slid through the pines like a distant whisper, brushing across the valley in slow, restless waves. But Adrian Cross had spent enough winters in harsh places to understand something most people forgot. Storms did not need to hurry. They always won in the end, if they were given enough time. He stood on the porch long after the others had gone inside, watching the snow gather on the railing. The flakes no longer fell straight down. They moved sideways now, carried by a wind that had begun to sharpen as night deepened. Ranger stood beside him. The German shepherd's sable coat was already dusted white along his back, but the dog seemed perfectly comfortable in the cold. His amber eyes scanned the darkness constantly, reading movement and scent with the patient focus of a seasoned guardian. Adrian reached down and brushed snow from the dog's neck. "You feel it too," he murmured. Ranger's ears twitched. The house behind them creaked softly, not in fear, in adjustment. Adrian listened carefully. The reinforced wall held steady. The roof braces carried the shifting weight of the first snowfall without complaint. So far, the structure was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Fight. He stepped back inside. Warm air wrapped around him immediately, carrying the scent of burning wood and oatmeal. The small room felt different than it had days ago. Smaller, perhaps, but also stronger. The wind no longer slipped easily through the walls. Elias sat near the stove, turning a small metal kettle slowly over the heat. The old man looked thoughtful. "Snow's building," he said quietly. Adrian nodded. "How bad does it look?" Adrian removed his gloves. "Hard to say yet." Noah sat on the floor beside the table with his notebook spread open. The boy had begun drawing again lines of rooftops and trees covered in snow. His pencil moved quickly, but Adrian noticed the way Noah occasionally glanced toward the window. Storms had a way of making children uneasy, even when they tried to act brave. Sarah Whitaker remained at the house longer than she had planned. When the snow first began falling, she had intended to drive back down to town, but the wind had already begun pushing drifts across the road. Elias had insisted she stay. She now sat at the small table reading quietly beneath the lamp. Up close, Adrian could see more of the details that defined her character. Her gray-green eyes were steady and attentive, the eyes of someone who listened carefully before speaking. Fine lines near the corners of her eyes suggested years of patience rather than worry lines earned from smiling gently at nervous children or calming frightened parents. She noticed Adrian watching the storm. "You're measuring it," she said. Adrian looked over. "What?" "The weather," she explained. "You keep studying it like it's an equation." Adrian leaned against the wall. "In a way it is." Sarah closed her book. "Can you solve it?" Adrian glanced toward the reinforced beams. "No." A small smile touched his face. "But you can prepare for the answer." Sarah seemed to consider that. Outside, the wind grew louder. Snow struck the north wall with a soft, steady hiss. The house responded with a low groan as the structure adjusted to the pressure. Elias listened carefully. "That sound new?" Adrian shook his head. "Normal." He walked toward the wall and placed his palm against the wood. Cold pressed through faintly, but far less than before. The insulation was working. For the next hour, the storm slowly tightened its grip on the valley. Snow piled against the base of the house. The wind shifted direction several times, testing each side of the structure like an unseen opponent searching for weakness. Adrian checked the roof supports twice, then the door seals, then the reinforced wall. Each time the structure held. Near midnight, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog had been lying near the stove, half asleep, but now his body stiffened. His ears angled sharply toward the road. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger stood slowly and walked toward the door. He sniffed the air through the narrow seam beneath it. Then he released a single short bark. Not loud, but urgent. Adrian opened the door slightly. The wind rushed in instantly, carrying snow and ice with it. Through the darkness, he could barely see the road below the hill. But Ranger stepped outside before Adrian could stop him. The dog moved several yards down the slope and stared into the storm. Adrian followed. "Ranger!" The wind howled louder now, pushing snow across the clearing in fast horizontal sheets. For several seconds, Adrian saw nothing. Then, far down the road, a faint flicker of light appeared through the blowing snow. Headlights. A vehicle struggling up the hill. Adrian exhaled slowly. Someone was driving in this storm. Ranger barked again. Inside the house, Elias had come to the door. "What is it?" "Truck," Adrian said. The headlights moved slowly, drifting side to side as the driver fought the icy road. Finally, the vehicle reached the clearing. It was Ben Carter's old pickup. The truck stopped crookedly near the porch. Ben climbed out quickly, pulling his coat tight against the wind. Snow clung to his beard and shoulders. "Storm's worse than expected," he shouted over the wind. Adrian stepped closer. "What happened?" Ben pointed down the valley. "Power lines came down near the South Ridge." Elias frowned. "That'll cut electricity to half the town." Ben nodded. "Already did." He glanced toward the house. "Figured you folks might be the only ones up here ready for this." Adrian looked at the reinforced walls, the angled roof supports, the sealed seams. Maybe Ben was right. Inside the house, warmth greeted them again. Ben stamped snow from his boots and looked around slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. The interior felt solid, stable, different. This place actually feels warmer than half the town. Adrian sat near the stove again. That's the idea. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow hammered the roof harder now. Wind screamed through the trees like a distant freight train, but the house did not tremble the way it might have days earlier. The reinforced beams carried the weight. The thickened walls blocked the wind, and the heat from the stove remained trapped within the structure. Adrian leaned back slightly, listening. The house was holding. Ranger finally returned to the warmth near the stove, shaking snow from his coat before settling down again beside Adrian. The dog looked satisfied. For the first time that night, Adrian allowed himself to relax slightly. The storm had come, but the house was ready. The storm did not end dramatically. There was no sudden silence, no clear moment when the wind simply stopped and the sky opened again. Instead, morning arrived slowly, almost cautiously, as if the valley itself were unsure whether winter had finished speaking. Adrian Cross woke before the others. He had slept lightly on the chair near the stove, boots still on, jacket folded beside him. Years of service had trained his body to rest whenever it could, and rise the moment the world changed around him. Something had changed. The wind was quieter. Not gone. Just tired. He stood slowly and walked to the window. Snow covered everything. The clearing outside the house had vanished beneath a deep blanket of white that smoothed the land into soft curves. The pine trees bowed under the weight of frozen powder, their branches drooping like old men who had worked too long. The storm had been stronger than the first snowfall suggested, but the house still stood. Adrian stepped onto the porch. The air was colder now, but calmer. Snow reached almost halfway up the porch railing, and the road down the hill had disappeared completely beneath drifting white waves. Ranger joined him a moment later. The German shepherd stretched slowly, his sable coat thick and slightly frosted at the edges. He stepped into the snow without hesitation, moving through it with the quiet confidence of a creature built for harsh winters. Adrian watched the dog carefully. "Go ahead," he said softly. Ranger trotted down the slope, sniffing the air and the ground with steady patience. The dog's tail moved slowly, not wagging, not tense, satisfied. Behind Adrian, the door creaked open. Elias stepped outside. The old man looked older this morning, the kind of tired that came from listening to a storm all night and wondering which sound might become the one that mattered. But his eyes moved immediately to the walls, then to the roof, then to the thick snow piled against the reinforced side of the house. He nodded once. "Well," Elias said quietly. Adrian glanced at him. It held. Elias allowed himself a small smile. "Guess it did." Inside the house, the others began to wake. Sarah emerged from the small bedroom first, her hair slightly loose from the long night, but her posture already composed. She paused near the doorway, watching Adrian and Elias study the snow-covered clearing. "No damage?" she asked. "None yet," Adrian replied. Ben Carter followed soon after. The mechanic moved stiffly, stretching his shoulders as if they had locked during the night. His beard looked even rougher than usual, and he scratched at it thoughtfully as he stepped onto the porch. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Adrian looked over. "What?" Ben gestured toward the valley. "Half the town probably lost roofs last night." He nodded toward the house. "And this place looks like it slept through it." Adrian didn't answer. He already knew why. Preparation rarely looked impressive, until it was tested. Noah appeared last. The boy stepped outside carefully, staring at the snow-covered world with wide eyes. "It's huge," he whispered. Snow drifted nearly to his knees. Adrian crouched beside him. "Storms always look bigger the morning after." Noah looked toward the valley. "Is the town okay?" Adrian followed his gaze. Hard to know from here, but the smoke rising from several chimneys suggested that at least some people had made it through the night. Elias placed a hand on the porch railing. "Road's going to be blocked." Ben nodded. "Probably for a day or two." Sarah folded her arms against the cold. "The school will be closed." Noah looked secretly pleased at that. Adrian noticed, but said nothing. The morning continued quietly. Ben helped Elias clear snow from the porch steps. Sarah prepared breakfast inside the house. Noah sat at the table drawing again. Adrian repaired a loose support beam on the back side of the porch, where snow had pushed slightly against the frame. The house was intact, but Adrian never trusted first impressions. He walked slowly around the structure again. North wall, still solid. Roof, snow resting evenly across the angled braces. Foundation, stable. Ranger followed closely behind him, nose low to the ground. Halfway around the house, the dog paused. Ranger did not bark. He simply stopped walking. His ears lifted slightly as he stared down the hill toward the valley road. Adrian followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then far below, barely visible between the trees, two figures moved slowly through the snow. Not walking. Struggling. Adrian narrowed his eyes. One of them slipped and nearly disappeared into the drift before the other pulled him upright. Ranger turned his head toward Adrian. The dog didn't need to speak. Adrian already understood. "Someone's coming," he murmured. Within minutes, the figures reached the base of the hill. The climb toward the house looked exhausting. Snow reached their thighs in places, and every step forward seemed to slide half a step back. Elias noticed them next. "Well now." Ben leaned over the railing. "Looks like Martin Pike." Adrian watched the men carefully as they finally reached the clearing. Martin Pike looked different today. The stubborn logger who had mocked the house 2 days earlier now appeared exhausted and humbled. His reddish beard was packed with ice, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had spent too many hours fighting wind and cold. Beside him stood another man Adrian had not met before. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with a narrow face and short, dark hair barely visible beneath a wool cap. His jacket was thin for the weather, and his hands shook slightly from the cold. Martin nodded toward Adrian. "Road's buried," he said breathlessly. Ben crossed his arms. "Figured that." Martin glanced at the house. Up close, the changes Adrian had made were impossible to ignore. Thicker walls. Angled roof braces. A reinforced entry. The structure looked strange compared to the simple houses scattered across Gray Hollow. But it also looked strong. Martin rubbed his frozen hands together. "Couple of roofs came down in town," he admitted. He paused before continuing. "Ben's garage lost half the siding." Ben grimaced. "Figures." The younger man beside Martin finally spoke. "My name's Caleb Foster," he said quietly. His voice carried the slight tremor of someone who had been cold for too long. "I live near the South Ridge." Adrian studied him briefly. Caleb looked like a man who worked outdoors, but had never quite grown used to the brutality of winter. "What brings you up here?" Adrian asked. Martin answered for him. "Town figured this place might still be standing." He looked around again. "Turns out they were right." Elias stepped forward slowly. "You boys need coffee." Martin nodded. "Wouldn't argue with that." Inside the house, warmth greeted them again. Steam rose from mugs placed quickly in their hands. Snow melted from their boots and coats, dripping onto the wooden floor. Martin sat heavily near the stove. For several minutes, he said nothing. Finally, he looked toward Adrian. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The words surprised no one. Adrian simply nodded. Martin studied the reinforced beams above the stove. "Guess ugly works better than pretty." Adrian allowed himself a small smile. "Sometimes." Noah watched the conversation carefully. His notebook rested open on the table beside him. The boy's pencil moved slowly across the page. When Adrian glanced down, he saw the drawing. The house stood on the hill surrounded by snow. Beside it stood a tall soldier, and near the soldier was a dog. But the boy had added something else this time. Several smaller figures stood near the door, people arriving, seeking warmth. Adrian studied the picture quietly. Outside, the storm clouds finally began to break. Sunlight slipped through the gray sky, touching the snow-covered valley with pale gold. Winter had tested the house, and the house had answered. Sometimes we think miracles must arrive loudly, with thunder, with clear answers, with everything suddenly resolved. But more often, miracles come quietly. They arrive when someone chooses to stop instead of walking past, when the heart listens before the mind has proof. when a dog senses what words cannot reach, and a person has the courage to trust that moment. Maybe God does not always remove the storm. Maybe He places the right person inside the storm at the exact moment they are needed, so no one has to face it alone. In our daily lives, we pass by many people carrying burdens we cannot see. A tired child, a silent fear, a door that only needs to be knocked on with gentleness. Faith does not exist only in churches or in prayers spoken out loud. Faith lives in choices, in compassion, in staying when leaving would be easier. If this story touched your heart, thank you for staying until the very end. Your time, your attention, and your willingness to listen are what give stories like this their meaning. Please share this video with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story spoke to you most, or where you are watching from. And if you believe in quiet miracles, in second chances, and in love that does not walk away, subscribe to this channel so we can continue this journey together. Finally, thank you once again for being here. May God watch over you, protect you through every season of life, and remind you that even in the coldest moments, you are never truly alone.